bare metal deployments to VMs to cloud phase and more recently to serverless architectures. I love my job because I get to explore two things that I'm passionate about: technology and people. So that's about me. Now Zenetics. So Zenetics is an IoT-based company where we specialize in delivering energy efficiency as well as asset management. We are part of the Hero Electronics group. Zenetics was founded in 2014, and we have already done more than 2,500 deployments across the country. We have more than 50,000 connected devices, and we collect over 100 million data points every day. Okay. So while we have some agenda to cover, I just wanted to get a quick sense from people if there is anything specific they want out of this session, and at what level of expertise do we have people in terms of Docker and Kubernetes. So if you wish, please share. Any specific expectations out of the session? Okay, then we'll stick to the agenda. So I'll be taking you through a little bit of the containers and Kubernetes, because I'm not sure at what level do we have everyone here. I will not get too much into depth. I'll try to cover it on a very high level. Maybe it will serve as a refresher for some people, and if some people are not aware, as an introduction. But please feel free to stop me if you think that you want something else to be covered. Okay. So containers, Docker, and Kubernetes. So we'll get into some reasoning. So this is a typical virtual machine setup. But let me go one step back. I remember in my initial days, the deployments used to happen on bare metal, right? Every year, the capacity planning used to be done that for this year's peak sales, how much of hardware do we need? And that many number of servers used to be procured, which used to take few months of time from starting the PO and delivery and installation in the data center. And then for the whole of the year, those servers would be wasted. We will not even use like 5 or 10% of the capacity on those servers. So gone are those days, thankfully, and a lot of things have changed since. The first thing that changed was we had virtualization come into picture, where things were abstracted from the bare metal. We could create multiple machines on top of a single physical host, and the applications would run on. Now this was fine, but there were few gaps, with this approach, as well as we can always do better. So along came this alternate way of doing things as containerized applications. So you see here that for every virtual machine that we host, we have its own copy of the operating system. An operating system is not light on resources, right? To run one application, I have to have this beast of a OS replicated across everything. And other things that happen in production systems is that if, let's say, I have a production server running for a long time, right? I get a production issue, and people get involved and they do some kind of fix. Let's say the fix was something with the memory settings or some huge pages settings, some let's say OS level changes that they have done to mitigate the particular issue. And over a period of time, this particular machine will take personality of its own. It will have a certain characteristics which may or may not be known to people. And if I kind of take that application and deploy it on a new machine, things may not be the same. And th- things like that. Something is running on this machine, and the same application does not run properly on the other machine, or maybe across environments it runs properly in the QA environment, but when it goes to production, something changes, and it's very hard to debug those things. Uh, so you know to solve those kind of dependency issues, as well as unnecessary wastage of resources by having multiple operating systems tied to each application, the idea of containerized application has come, where everything that is needed for an application to run is packaged into one container. And we will get into this. So basically, uh, how do we create the container is, we write a manifest file. We call this a Docker file, which just kind of instructs as to what all things do we need. Let's say we need a base CentOS image. On top of that, I need to install my Java. I need to install some more dependencies, and then I need to run this particular application. I just define these things, and then I run a build process which creates a Docker image. The Docker image is kind of same as any other analogy of the image that we have, a VM image or an ISO image. In that way, it kind of has everything ready to deploy my application. All the dependencies are packaged into this image. From this image, when I use this image and run, I create a container in the runtime, and that is the kind of environment inside which my application is run. Here you can kind of see it in a different way, that client runs on this machine where Docker is installed. Using the Docker daemon, builds the images, and images are kind of stored in the registry. And when we run uh, the container using an image, that is when these containers get created from an image that is stored in the repository. Now, I just want to kind of uh, give some basic reasoning behind what makes a container possible. Uh, I wish I had more clarity on, you know, what do we need out of this, but I'll quickly go through this. Uh, there are a few basic things that make a Docker container possible. Namespaces, C groups, and the file system and copy and write. I'll quickly walk through that. So in a physical, let's say in a virtual machine, we already have a file system set. I already have some networking done in place. Now, if I am not having multiple copies of operating system within the same operating system, if I have to isolate these things, I need to have a way. And it seems Linux already had some kind of a way to namespace these things, be it file system, be it the networking. There is a way that they can be namespaced into separate categories where communication between them is not possible. Let us say that I create two, in case of a network namespace, I create two parallel. So there is in the virtual machine, I have ETH0, and I use a Docker and create multiple of these ETH0 for their own containers. Now, this network is specific only to this container. It cannot talk to this container over the same network. So likewise, file systems. Now, each container gets its own file system starting from root. And likewise, there are multiple namespaces where things get isolated for each container. So, there is no kind of outside influence on that. That is one thing. Other thing is the C group. So C group is the control group, which kind of tells that a certain process, how much of the resources it can take. Now, if I'm running multiple containers on a machine, it should not be that one machine takes up a whole lot of resources and other containers just can't run on it. So there's a way to limit the resource. So if the application needs more than that, it's just that that application gets killed, but doesn't impact anything else. Uh, Third is the union file system, where there is kind of a concept of layering uh, of the images. And so let's say the idea is that, let's say we want a file to be changed. Now, uh, this let's say this is my image, which is based on multiple layers, and a particular file which might exist in, sorry, a particular image that might exist in this particular layer, a particular file that might exist in this layer. If I want to change that, I do not have to go back and change a particular layer. I just change it on the top layer, and whatever is on the top layer overrides everything below it. So if I have to make some very small change, I just need a very small thin layer on top. So what that does is that a very small change that I need to make, I don't need to really read what you say, build the whole of the image. 90% of my work is done for me, only 10% delta I need to do, and that makes it very, very fast to do builds and deployment. So this is just some basic background about what makes a container possible. Now, containers, however amazing they are, once they go over a certain number, it can really be difficult to manage the containers. Technologies like Docker do provide, technologies for some level of orchestration, but they are still not at that level where industry wants it to be. And that is where this Kubernetes comes into picture for managing the containers. So Kubernetes is like this conductor, and managing all the different containers across the cluster. So this is the architecture of the Kubernetes, where we have in the Kubernetes cluster, we have a control plane, the machines, storage, and registry. So control plane is what is responsible for making things run across the environment. Compute machines are the actual nodes where containers get deployed. It is the job of this control plane to figure out what to run where. Now, I just want to talk about a few essential objects of Kubernetes uh, to kind of give a sense of what it is. So everything in Kubernetes is known as an object, and I will talk about the three most important objects: the pod, the deployment, and the service. Pod comes from this, a pod of this P, where you can have few of the containers running within this thing, within a pod. But the thing is that this is the smallest unit that can be deployed. This is the smallest unit that can be scaled. If I say that I need two of something running, I can only say I need to have two of the pods running. One pod can have a few containers, even though it's not a very common practice to run a lot of containers within a pod, but I can have. But in terms of deployment and scaling, I can only do it at the pod level. And each pod gets its own environment, its own networking namespace and storage, which can be shared by containers within the pod. So that is a pod. Deployments are kind of defining how a pod should be and kind of defining the desired state of the pod. So like in this animation on the right, I say that I want 3 of my Node.js pods running. right? And now Kubernetes will, so all I do is I define a deployment object, and then Kubernetes ensures that it runs three of those pods wherever it finds it available. It could be running, so all these three could be running on the same node. All these three could be running on, different nodes which are part of the Kubernetes cluster. So that is a deployment. So while deployments ensure that how many ever number of pods that we want to run are always running, service is what makes the pods accessible to the outside world. Because pods and containers are all ephemeral. Now, if I want, let's say I'm running a database or maybe an API to an external world, I do not want to give the IP of the pod, because once the pod is rebooted, the IP will change. So this is abstracted using something known as service, where I give the IP of the service, and behind the service knows how many pods are running. It will route the traffic appropriately to the pods. So if this is like, say, let's say an API service, the service can act as a load balancer and send the requests to each of the pods behind it, and maybe in a round robin fashion. Those things can be configured. That's a service. This is just to give you a flavor of how do we define things within Kubernetes. It's kind of like, infrastructure as a code. Now here what I'm saying is that this is a deployment, and I'm saying this, so create a pod using this spec. I want 3 of this thing running, Nginx running, and I also give the name of the image. The registry for this Kubernetes is already kind of configured, so I don't need to give the whole URL and all that of the image repository. I just mention the image name and the version name. So what its deployment is going to do is it's going to take this image, create a container out of it, deploy it within a pod, and create 3 such pods, and ensure that 3 are running. For whatever reason, if one goes down, if the node goes down or whatever happens, it will ensure that it finds the right place for it to run. And also, yeah, expose the appropriate ports also. Yeah. So there are just 2 things that I wanted to call out, which are very different in the world of Kubernetes. This is a declarative way of doing things. I'm telling Kubernetes that I want this to be running with 3 replicas. So just run it for me. I don't have to worry about it. Traditionally, we kind of take care of these things. Wherever it is running, we have to ensure that these many number of application instances are running to meet, let's say, a desired throughput in terms of a process or in terms of a real-time service. I need to ensure a certain number is running, and if it's not running, then I will probably write some scripts of my own to start a process if it gets killed. All that manual effort needs to be done. Now in case of Kubernetes, nothing of that sort. We just tell Kubernetes that this is what needs to happen, and only condition is that it should have that much capacity available. I cannot just say run 100 replicas while I don't have the capacity to run 100. As long as I have capacity in my entire cluster, how many ever nodes I have, it will find the right place to run this. And utilization of resources. Now in the world of VM, we just waste resources because we kind of procure the VMs, even the VMs, not just the physical host, even the VMs for the peak volume that we have. And peak volume doesn't always happen on a daily basis. So I over allocate those CPU and memory, which kind of go waste. But in case of Kubernetes, the particular container or the particular pod will use only amount of resources that are necessary for it to run. and the remaining resources on the node can be leveraged by any other process. So just this, while this background is covered, I just want to come to this discussion as to why we chose to do things on Kubernetes. One thing is that it supports the microservices architecture. We already saw how there is a layer of service in between where I do not care how many pods are running behind it. I just get one IP, and behind that it takes care of it. Abstracts multiple services from me, and it's very easy to scale the services. In where I am just saying that the replica 3, if I just say replica 6, 6 things will be created without me worrying about those things. So as we are also moving towards a more microservice based architecture, this is the right choice for us to go. In terms of cost, if I run the same workload on VMs, because it's not going to be efficient, I am going to over allocate things for each VM. I'm going to spend a lot more, and we will come to this cost aspect in a different slide. Because it's declarative, my pain is lesser. We've already talked about that. I just tell Kubernetes what to do and it does. Overall, it has simplified management for us. The way things are integrated within Kubernetes, the way the monitoring is integrated, the way this declarative kind of thing works, that it takes care of things. A lot of my pain of managing things has gone away. Like optimal resource utilization of resources. Cost is one aspect, but of course we don't want to waste things, right? Which generally happens with VMs. Scalability. So there are components that we're using which need to be scaled up and down based on certain needs. And in the world of VM, it would become a little tricky to do that. It's not that it's not possible. It's not as simple as just changing one number in a file and just saving it. So this definitely is a big thing for us. We don't really need to, create a golden image of things and then create new VMs when we need to scale and then destroy those. We don't have to manage that. We just, play with the manifest files. And of course, service discovery and load balancing. How services talk to each other. We are kind of getting a service layer kind of layer out of box in Kubernetes. And of course, no vendor or no cloud provider lock-in. We see that a lot of these big four cloud providers have started, coming up with more efficient things which are only going to work on their cloud. A lot of the, let's say, the serverless things that they come up with, or a lot of the database solutions that they come up with, may make sense, for certain use cases. But then, if you choose to migrate from one cloud to other, then it's very, very difficult. So we want to keep our stack as much as vendor agnostic as possible. So this is how our Kubernetes stack looks like. We have one master, and we have 4 large worker nodes and 5 medium worker nodes. We have the Ceph storage for our persistent volumes, and we have Metal LB for managing the ingress into the Kubernetes cluster. So I have to expose a lot of IPs outside of my Kubernetes cluster. Like I'm getting data from all the sensors across the country into this cluster, into my Kafka. So that IP that I have exposed is exposed through this Metal LB layer. I'm running a lot of these services, Postgres, Redis. There is a OLAP kind of a database which provides very fast aggregations. Druid, I'm using for monitoring Elastic Prometheus. We're running, of course, we're running Kafka, and our primary stack is on Django and Python. So now, cost. So we were running our stack on Azure Cloud, and we were using 44 cores and 256 GB of RAM, and we were paying, 164,000 per month. And for more resources, we are paying so much less on E2E. And that was one of the biggest motivations for us to migrate our workload from Azure to E2E. That we can, and even with this, we were running very tight. We did not have a lot of room. If we had to kind of do scaling, we had to kind of add a new node to this cluster. Right. So to give you some kind of breakup of how this thing works. So in terms of storage, for us, E2E proved to be 28% cheaper. In terms of VM, it proved to be 75% cheaper. And because E2E does not charge for network, we straight away saving that cost. And overall, it comes down to 66% cloud savings for our Kubernetes cluster. Of course, there's no free lunch. So for the 66% cost, what is it that we have to do differently now that we are running our stack on E2E? One thing is that Azure, E2E, Azure, Google, Amazon, and others, they their Kubernetes is managed, what they call as managed Kubernetes. They take care of the master completely. We don't have to worry about the master, and they ensure the redundancy and everything. So that kind of is now our responsibility to manage the master node. uh, Upgrading the version of the Kubernetes, would have been like one click. You just save this version, and then as soon as that version is available on that cloud, it becomes very straightforward. But in this case, we have to manually do certain things. Node auto scaling. Do we have questions? Okay, so because I don't see the actual names here, the question was that the ISI image. Okay, I'll take that in the end.
Yeah, Ishan, the first question is like, can you please tell the size of the ISO image? And generally, we have in GBs, is it same space?
So the Docker image that we are talking about can be like very small, can be like 100 MB also, maybe even less than that. If you are just running one specific thing out of, so in the operating system we have lot of things, a lot of packages and everything. I don't need all of that. I just need, let's say, bare minimum, my Python or my Java is installed, and that is all. If I want to run, then it can just run within the 100 or 200 MB, right? Next question is, so let
So
me know if that answers this question.
okay, so next question actually, Ishan, is Kubernetes with Windows Node. How do we use it for Windows servers, replications, scalability, MS SQL DB server? Is it good to use Windows with Kubernetes?
So Windows containers have also kind of been possible recently, uh, because the reasoning that I was giving you initially with namespaces and C groups, those were part of the Linux operating system. So the containers evolved around Linux. But what I have read recently is that even Windows has kind of made some kernel changes, and even they kind of now support the namespaces and other things. So now it is also feasible to run Windows containers, but I'm not sure how many people run a Windows container in production. I mean, wherever I have seen, people are running only Linux containers, but now it is possible.
Okay. So one more I can see, like he mentioned, like, so it will create any problem during running.
I think this is the follow-up from the first question.
Yeah.
No, no, not at all, not at all. Actually, uh, actually, running something as a Docker container is a very good idea because you ensure that whatever is needed for your application is packaged as part of that. So it should never go wrong unless you miss something, then it may go wrong, but it should not go wrong. And I think, you know, I'll say one more thing which will help you understand this better. So basically, let me go back to this slide. So basically here you see that in case of VM, every VM had its own operating system. In case of containers, there is one operating system, right? So it's not that we don't have that, uh, operating system thing. It is just that we have only one operating system. Primarily in case of Linux, what we mean is that it has the Linux kernel is there, which interacts with the hardware and everything. That needs to be only one. On top of the kernel, whatever is the file system or network namespaces, those are kind of isolated and created separately as containers. So your application, which is running as a containerized application, it has, let's say, only your application file, maybe a what you say a runtime environment like Java, and that's all. If that's all it has, then that is all it needs to run. It does not need a whole lot of things to run that application. So it's actually a good idea to run things as Docker containers. Let me know if that answers your question.
So one more question actually, Ishan. Does E2E Kubernetes have auto scale features enabled for Kubernetes?
Yeah, so let me do one thing. Let me quickly walk through this last slide. There's few of the things I mentioned here. So I was saying that master node we have to take care, upgrade we have to take care. Next was the auto node scaling. So in terms of scaling, there are two things, right? One is pod scaling. That if I was running 3 Nginx pods, I need to run more, right? That is there. That is part of standard Kubernetes. Wherever you run Kubernetes, that is given to you. That Kubernetes takes care. The other aspect of scaling is node auto scaling. That is when if I am running a 10 node cluster and now I am asking to scale my a heavy database application to run another instance, then it may not find enough space in these 10 nodes to run that particular container. If my node auto scaling was turned on, or if that feature is available, then what happens is that in that case it just spins up a new pod, adds that to the Kubernetes cluster, and runs my application there. And at a later point of time, it keeps on monitoring. If my workload is reduced, then it may even reduce that, remove an additional node and move the workload to a different uh, node. So this particular thing, as of now, is not there in E2E. It is there in the roadmap of E2E, and we are also eagerly waiting to make use of this. Right. There is no kind of cloud provided load balancer. That is why we have to use a Metal LB within our own cluster. In general, if you see in Azure or Google or Amazon, there is a layer of load balancer beyond your Kubernetes setup. And uh, so what has happened is that these cloud providers have kind of contributed back to the Kubernetes, and they have kind of created, let's say, plugins for Kubernetes for their particular cloud environments, so that Kubernetes is better able to understand their cloud environment. because of that, Kubernetes gets to understand that, when I'm saying load balancer, I mean AWS load balancer, and I can get hold of that. But that is not there in K2E as of now. Few things about managing storage. We are having a persistent volume given to us through a Ceph storage cluster. But we have to kind of run a particular driver, let's say, on every node of Kubernetes to make that interface happen. It's not that seamless. We have to kind of run something within the cluster to make it happen. And in terms of private networking, even though the cluster is created on the private network, the nodes have public adapters, network adapter also enabled, and that is why I'm able to expose the ports there. Which, if we manage it well, is not a problem. Generally, in Azure and all sorts of managed clusters, we can't even SSH into the nodes. This whole thing is abstracted away from us. But here you can SSH into the nodes, and because you can SSH into the nodes, you can do some. You can touch few basic files and do something. But if you are responsible, then it's not. So these are the points, and there are a few more questions.
Yeah, so actually one person have asked in the chat, so let me read out the question. So any possibilities to run ASP.NET and MS SQL web application on this? Still we are using Windows servers. Any chance to change to Linux to run our application? Actually, it's asked in the chat. You can check if you want.
Yeah, I'm looking at that. So, see, Windows containers, I'm not very sure. See, what happens is that to run something on the container, we first create what we say as a Docker file, and there we define the steps. Let me just show you. I have something there. I'm showing you one of the Docker files that we have. So here I'm saying that create an image, start from the basic Python image. And if you look at this Python image will have, start from a basic Ubuntu image and install Python on it. Then here we do few things. We copy our files and we run few other things. In the end, you can also have a CMD command which says what needs to run when we say run a container, what command needs to be executed can also be part of this Docker file. This can also be outside of Docker file, given during the runtime. But basically, if you have to run your, let's say, database or whatever application you're saying, then there should be a way for us to create a Docker file like this. And you can kind of Google, MS SQL Docker, and then you can find someone has already created this Docker file. Somewhere if you go, you should be able to see the actual file also. I'm not able to see that here, but it's there. You can make use of this.
Yeah, one more question actually, Ishan. I have seen a lot of companies do not deploy database, example MySQL, as part of their K8 cluster, and they prefer using managed database service. Does it really have any impact on any special requirement for hosting database inside K8, like Kubernetes?
See, I think that's a good question. There in the community also there is a lot of debate about running stateful applications within Kubernetes. I think some people say that it is not in the principle of Kubernetes to run stateful applications. It's more around stateless applications. but then there are people who argue otherwise also. And we have also gone through that journey. And for us, we have seen that running our database within Kubernetes gives us more flexibility, because we are managing the whole thing as a piece. In terms of scaling, we're getting all the benefits, and we also don't want to locked into a vendor. Generally, managed services means you kind of get locked in to the vendor, and you also have to look at the costs that makes sense to you. Definitely, using a managed service for database probably is going to be easy to manage. That overhead will be gone for you. You don't have to do things on your own. But in our case, we wanted to have it independent, not depend on the cloud provider, as well as in certain cases like we are using the Druid database and all that. In that case, that Druid database has already created an architecture in such a way that there are 5-6 different components which can be scaled independently. Like for example, the read and write. Now, if today my write to the database is more, all I need to do is I need to scale up those particular nodes of the database which handle the write. Now today, if my read has doubled, I will need to scale up only those nodes which are responsible for read. So that way, the architecture of databases has also evolved, and because we are using that, it makes sense for us to run that within the cluster, because then we can easily manage the scaling.
Okay. So we can take few more questions. Attendees can actually ask. We have 10 more minutes. So any questions from like attendee side? Yeah, I think I got one more question. How Kubernetes are useful for a CRM-based applications which are running hundreds of instances using PHP, MySQL, and Apache in a single server. Ishan?
Yeah. So, see, something running within a single server means if that server goes down, the whole thing is down. I don't know how having such an application people feel confident in production, but I will tell you this thing that the let's say, for the lack of words, let's say the trend right now is that your application should have a microservices kind of architecture where things are already isolated and differentiated, each thing having its own responsibility, having its own database, having its own boundary, and talking to each other over API or over Q or Kafka. That is how all solutions are evolving. And in this particular case, if we are running multiple applications within the same VM, those things can also run within the Kubernetes cluster. All the only difference will be that right now you are probably you've configured the database maybe as a local host connection, local host 5302. In that case, you will have to use an IP of the service, which is abstracting your database from other services. Likewise, if something is calling another service over localhost, then instead of localhost, it will become the IP of the service. But if it's like the problem you're saying is like of being a monolith of an application, that one application is doing so many things, then it won't help much, because if you have to scale, you have to scale the whole of the beast in one shot. Instead of if you break it down, then you scale only what is needed for you to scale. Right. So hope that answers.
Actually, he replied that actually in that case RDS might help, right? So the same question continue, I guess.
RDS?
Actually, same person actually told that the same question, that CRM based application, that question he has mentioned. Actually,
Yeah,
in
yeah.
that case, RDS might help.
Yeah, Amazon relational database service. See, anything that you used as managed will definitely reduce your burden initially. But you also have to see how it impacts your cost. And do you really want to, like, if you, I'm assuming you're talking about Amazon relational database service only. Now, tomorrow, if you want to change your cloud vendor for whatever reason, right? Your clients want it to be on a different cloud provider, or you want to be on independent cloud provider. Then to migrate these things, it's not that straightforward. Every cloud provider gives efficiencies in their own ways, and other cloud provider may not have done things that way only. And we build on top of those dependencies. Then in the long run, sometimes we may get stuck. So I think in this particular instance, it is good to kind of read through a little more, with these points that I've mentioned, and see if you still think it's a good decision.
Okay, so one more question actually. Persistent volume concept can follow in Kubernetes as it happens like Docker. Kindly explain.
Yeah, yeah. So I think in my slide also I had mentioned that. Yeah. So this persistent storage, right? Yeah. So yeah, just like Docker, like we attach a volume to the container, like that. There are Kubernetes objects, and I think one thing that can help is, yeah, this documentation. If you see, the official documentation, here you will find a lot of good information. Kubernetes. What's this? So, like here, we create. Let's see. Um, yeah, you define and you mount your volume. So in this case, you kind of create a storage class which interacts with your particular storage. Like in our case, we are using a Ceph storage cluster, right? This is not the same storage cluster that is used by Amazon or Azure. They are using some different technology. To abstract that storage from the Kubernetes, there is a layer as a storage class. You need to create the storage class, and then using that storage class, we create different persistent volume claims for our objects. Here we would have seen, like, yeah, you create a storage class, you tell what kind of, for your cluster, whatever storage cluster is there, you abstract that using a storage class, and wherever in your pod you need, that is where you just mention that uh, the storage class, whatever you have created, storage class, and then you kind of give few more things, whatever is needed. And in general, this thing is also expandable. So if you kind of attach, let's say, 10 GB of persistent volume, you can always increase and go beyond, but you cannot decrease. That's the case with almost all storage providers. You cannot decrease the storage.
One person has replied that for the persistent volumes, simplest way is to create NFS storage and then mount on all worker node and create the PVC. So he has
Right.
replied, yeah.
Right. So that is there, but So like there are three types of storage thing, right? Even Ceph provides object storage, file storage, and block storage, right? So depending on what is needed, like in our case, we run Kafka using persistent volume, as well as we run our Druid database. Now, Druid database kind of needs a file share across multiple pods. It needs to have the same thing, but Kafka does not need those things. So wherever we have this kind of file share kind of storage, that is typically slower than this object storage. So, depending on what is your need, you choose the appropriate storage type, and using these storage classes, you abstract that out and claim uh, it in your uh, pod.
Okay. So, Ishan, anything else? Actually, I think we don't have any more questions. Anything else you want to share with all our attendees?
No, I think that is it. I would just say that whatever questions you have, this Kubernetes documentation is pretty thorough. And if you have any follow-up questions, you can reach out.
Okay, okay. Yeah, so actually, time is like almost like over. So let us thanks Ishan for sharing us like this valuable knowledge with us. Also, I would like to thank you all the attendees for joining us this webinar and making this webinar CTO Talk successful. So we will share you all a feedback form. So all the attendees will receive a feedback form after the webinar, and I would like to receive all the feedback so that we can improve in our upcoming webinars. Also, we are planning to schedule one more webinar in the month of October on the fourth week on the same on Tuesday. So we will keep you posted for that. Okay, we will keep all the updates about the coming webinars. We will share you over email, and if you are following us on LinkedIn, you will get all the updates. So yeah, so thank you, Ishan. Thank you all. Have a great rest of the day. We'll see you in the coming week.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye. Have a great day.